Hello, listeners. Welcome to IT Guy Who Lifts podcast. I'm your host, Palash Gupta, Diploma in Nutrition and Fitness Sciences from INFS India, and Bachelor's in Sports and Exercise Science from Loughborough University, UK. The goal of this podcast is to understand science and science based tools with the help of industry experts so that we can further optimize our training and nutrition program. With that in mind, let's jump right into today's podcast. Hello, listeners. Today we have been graced by the presence of Dr. Anna Lembke. So, without further ado, let me pass the baton towards Dr. Lemke so that she can give the listeners a brief introduction about herself, her professional endeavors, and how she got fascinated about knowing the science behind addiction. So, but before that, Dr. Lemke, on this podcast, we actually urge and request our guests to give a bit longer version about themselves when it comes to the introduction, because we want to know all the events which unfolded in front of our guests, which made them walk down this path and become the person that they are today. So, with that in mind, Dr. Lemke, the floor is all yours. Walk us through your entire journey so that we can connect you on much deeper level.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here and to talk to your audience and to talk about um, Dopamine Nation. And I am a psychiatrist. I am on the faculty here at the Stanford University School of Medicine. My job consists of seeing patients, teaching and mentoring students and trainees in the field of mental health, and also doing research. And I ended up here in Northern California and here at Stanford because I came out for medical school in the early 1990s. And ironically, when I first came to medical school, it was not my plan to go into psychiatry, and I chose pathology first. And one of the reasons that I chose pathology, which is the study of tissues essentially, in order to detect the presence of disease, I really wanted science and medicine to be black and white. I wanted things to be definitive. I didn't want there to be any ambiguity. And of course, psychiatry and mental illness is full of ambiguity. So that was not something that initially appealed to me. Um, so I finished medical school and I went into pathology, and I was a pathologist, and I was looking at things like pap smears all day. And I really missed seeing patients. But also, I realized that although I had really liked my psychiatry rotations in medical school, that really in not choosing psychiatry, I was running away from a thing that fascinated me but made me afraid. And the reason that psychiatry made me afraid was because there's a lot of mental illness in my own family, and I really felt like I couldn't handle seeing mentally ill people every day, that somehow it was too close to home. In particular, one of my younger sisters, when she was a Stanford undergraduate, she had a psychotic manic episode and ended up hospitalized at the Stanford locked unit. And that was really scary and devastating, and one of the reasons why I did not initially choose psychiatry. But after graduating and after being a pathologist for a little bit, and after kind of realizing I wasn't a very good pathologist too, I didn't sort of have the patience for the kind of detail work that it required. I actually decided to switch my residency and go back into psychiatry. And I'm really glad I did, because as soon as I was seeing mentally ill patients, I realized, oh, yep, these are my people. These are the people that I was meant to help. And it just felt like I had, kind of found the thing that I should be doing, which is always a good feeling. And then when I finished my residency in psychiatry, I joined the Stanford faculty. And initially, I was going to see patients with mood disorders. And so I told the people who schedule patients, I said, I'll see anybody, any kind of mood disorder, any kind of person, I'll see them. But just don't send me people who are addicted to drugs. and alcohol. I said, don't send me those people because I don't really know how to help those people. And also, like, they need to go somewhere else and get that taken care of, and then they can come back. And then I'll deal with their mania and their depression. And of course, that was a ridiculous thought on my part, but it was consistent with the way I was trained. And when in medical school and medical training in the 1990s, including mental health training, there was really this idea that addiction is not a medical problem. It's a willpower problem. It's a social problem, but it's not a disease. And so we really weren't taught any tools for how to address addiction. And we were furthermore taught, even among psychiatrists, that patients needed to go to rehab, and then when they had that all taken care of, they could come back and we would address their depression. So the intake folks, those are the folks who kind of screen the patients and refer them, they were so cute. They kind of came sheepishly after a little bit. They said, well, Dr. Lembke, we understand you don't want any patients who have other like problems like drug and alcohol, but it turns out when we screen those people out, there are no patients left. So, so I said, oh, really? Okay, I didn't know that. The point being that many, many people, who have depression, anxiety, mania, psychosis, are also struggling with a co-occurring substance use problem. So that was my first inkling that, gee whiz, maybe I should, figure out how to deal with that problem. The other really big moment when I realized I need to figure out how to help people with addiction was a patient of mine I'd been seeing for about a year for depression who wasn't getting better no matter how many medications I prescribed. And then one day her brother called me and he said, she's been in a car accident. And I said, oh my goodness, what happened? He said, well, she's using again. And I said, using? Using what? And he said, using heroin. Isn't that what you've been treating her for? We've been paying the bills all this time. We thought you were treating for her for her opioid problem. And I was like, no, I didn't even know she used drugs. So that was also like a real important turning point in my career, because I had never once asked that patient about drug and alcohol use. We had talked about every single, major developmental milestone, her relationship with her mother, money, sex, you named it. We talked about it all, but I'd never asked her about drugs and alcohol. And, she never volunteered the information, but it really wasn't her responsibility to do so. It was my responsibility as her psychiatrist to ask her about it. And I didn't ask her about it. And in not asking her, I actually harmed her, right? Because I ignored the elephant in the room, and her addiction got worse in the time that she was seeing me, and she almost died from it. So that was the moment where I said, oh boy, I need to educate myself. So from that moment forward, I set out to learn as much as I could about addiction. I learned from my patients, I learned from colleagues, I learned from books, I learned from meetings, I learned from science. And ultimately, I became the person in my department that saw people with addiction problems. And as I saw more and more patients with addiction, I discovered two things. The first thing I discovered was that I really like people who have addiction. And the second thing I discovered is that people with addiction get better. And when they get better, not only are their lives transformed for the positive, but so are the lives of many people around them, their children, their spouses, their colleagues, their friends. So it's become really, something that I do with a great deal of humility, because I'm still always learning, but also just a great deal of passion, because I feel that it's such an important and growing problem. Even within my 25-year career, seeing more and more patients struggling with addiction to pills that doctors prescribe, addiction to things that aren't even drugs, things like gambling, pornography, shopping, eating. And I really do think that the neuroscience framework for understanding what's happening in the brain convinces me that it is a disease, that medicine should treat it, and that neuroscience lens helps people understand what's happening to them, which I think also empowers them to try to get better. So was that long enough?
Yes.
Was that long enough?
Yeah, that was really, really great introduction, because I haven't heard this kind of a story where This shows a huge paradigm shift, how you actually started and how you actually transitioned into the work that you are currently doing today. Because you started with the thing that you do want to see the patients who are
Yeah.
coming with an addiction like alcohol or any kind of a substance abuse, and now you majored in that, and now how that's how you find your true calling. So that was really, really fascinating thing to know about. So that
Oh,
was such a
well,
great introduction.
good,
Uh,
good. Well,
I,
and it's really informed sort of one of my major life philosophies as well, that we have to stay open to what the
yep.
universe invites us or calls us to do. And when we do that, we really can find our meaning and purpose without necessarily going to look for it. It will
Yes.
kind of present itself if we're open to the call.
Yes, indeed. The opportunity will knock at our door. We just have to be resilient enough to listen to those opportunities and answer by opening that door, right?
Nice. Yeah, really nicely said.
Yep. So, with that in mind, that was a really great segue. We are going, before we deep dive into today's agenda, because we are going to talk a lot about dopamine, which is a neurotransmitter, I want you to set a baseline of the terminology so that we can get our listeners on a base level of understanding what are these things are. They might have heard about them, they might not have heard about them, they might be having some kind of a knowledge, hit or miss, but before that, I want you to, you can say, define what these neurotransmitters are and just guide us through the neurochemistry of our brain before we deep down into our agenda for today.
Okay. So, dopamine is the name of a chemical that is made in our brains. And specifically, dopamine is a neurotransmitter. And neurotransmitters are the molecules that bridge the gap between neurons. So, neurons are these long, spindly cells in our brains that conduct an electrical signal that create the neural circuits that create our thoughts, emotions, beliefs, you name it. But neurons don't actually touch. There's a little space between them end to end, and that space is called the synapse. And neurotransmitters are the molecules that bridge that space. One of the metaphors that I like to use is if you imagine that neurotransmitters are baseballs and that the pitcher is the presynaptic neuron and the catcher is the postsynaptic neuron, then neurotransmitters like dopamine get thrown from the presynaptic neuron across that space between pitcher and catcher and get caught by the receptor, which is really like a catcher's mitt on the postsynaptic neuron. And dopamine in the brain has a number of different functions, but one of the most important functions is that it's a very important signal for the experience of pleasure, reward, and motivation, especially in a part of our brain called the reward pathway. And that reward pathway is primarily composed of the nucleus accumbens, the ventral tegmental area, and the prefrontal cortex. Those are areas of the brain that you don't really have to remember. Just know that there's a specific cortex or a specific circuit that is really important to this experience of like wanting something and liking something and being motivated to get that thing. Interestingly, dopamine is also very important to movement. So it's the neurotransmitter that allows us to move. And when we don't have enough of that neurotransmitter, we can develop a disease called Parkinson's disease, where we get really stiff. And I think it's interesting and important that dopamine's involved both in movement and in reward, because of course, we have to typically, or at least prior to modern times, get up and work and move our bodies in order to get the reward that we want, whether it's, the woolly mammoth or water or, a partner, some shelter. And even, this area of the brain called the reward pathway is highly conserved across species and through evolution. So it hasn't changed very much for millions of years. Even the most primitive worm will release dopamine in response to food in its nearby environment. So dopamine has been around, since the beginning of time, basically. and is really, really fundamental, even in the most primitive species, to locomotion, movement, reward, motivation, getting those things that we need to keep us alive.
Great, great introduction and really well summarized, I must say. And just as you mentioned that there is this reward pathway and dopamine is one of the major player of these pathway, what are the other neurotransmitters that you can recall upon which also play a major role in this reward pathway? Because our human body has this kind of a push-pull mechanism. For every one thing, there is another thing attached to it, right? So what are the other neurotransmitter which are also important in this reward pathway?
Yeah, so there are lots of other neurotransmitters that, play an important role. There's our endogenous opioid system. So we make our own opioids, from the opium poppy. Well, we make our own, enkephalins and endorphins, our own endogenous opioids. There's the whole endocannabinoid system. So we know that, everybody knows about cannabis. But we make our own version of cannabis that binds to the anandamide receptors. Anandamide is Sanskrit for bliss. Also, there are the monoamine neurotransmitters, things like norepinephrine and serotonin, which are important neurotransmitters for reward, motivation, but also other types of feedback loops. So it's not that dopamine is the only neurotransmitter involved in this process, but it is probably the most important one and the final common pathway for many different types of rewards.
Definitely, such a great explanation. And in your book, you have talked about this and pain balance, right? What is this pleasure-pain paradox, if I would like to call it? Is this a paradox just like our Schrodinger's cat paradox or grandfather paradox? How this pans out in the reality and the neurochemistry of our brain science? What is
Yeah.
this pain and pleasure paradox, basically?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the really interesting findings in neuroscience in the past 100 years or so is that the same parts of the brain that process pleasure also process pain. So there's a lot of overlap in those brain regions. And pleasure and pain work like opposite sides of a balance. So if you imagine that in that reward pathway that we were talking about, there's a little miniature balance like a beam on a center fulcrum. Um, and when we experience pleasure, the balance tips one way. And when we experience pain, it tips in the opposite direction. And one of the overarching rules governing this balance is that it wants to remain level. And our brains will work very hard to restore a level balance, also called homeostasis, with any deviation from neutrality. So I really like chocolate. So if I eat a piece of chocolate, I get a little release of dopamine in my brain's reward pathway, and my balance tips slightly to the side of pleasure. But no sooner has that happened than my brain will adapt to that change by downregulating my own dopamine production, transmission receptors, not just to baseline level, but actually below baseline level before going back to the level balance. I like to imagine that as these little gremlins hopping on the pain side of my balance to bring it level again, but the gremlins like it there, so they stay on until I'm tipped an equal and opposite amount to the side of pain. That's the moment of wanting one more piece of chocolate. Or with more potent intoxicants, it's the come down or the hangover. Now, if we wait long enough, sometimes just moments, in other cases hours, those gremlins will hop off, dopamine will be upregulated again, and our balance will go back to the neutral or level position. So the key point there is for every pleasure, there's a cost, and that the way that the brain restores homeostasis is not just bringing dopamine levels back to baseline tonic levels of firing, but actually bringing it below baseline before bringing it level again. And that's really, really important because what it means, the broader implication is that with repeated exposures to rewards, and either the same reward or even a different reward that works similarly, what ends up happening is we start to accumulate these neuroadaptation gremlins on the pain side of our balance in order to compensate for those intense rewards, especially when you think about modern rewards that release a lot more dopamine than our primitive brains were evolved to handle. Such that over time, we end up in a dopamine deficit state with our pleasure pain balance tilted semi-permanently to the side of pain. In other words, those gremlins are now camped out, barbecues and tents in tow on the pain side of our balance. So that means that now we need to use our drug not to feel good, but just to level the balance and feel normal. We need more and more potent forms of our drug and more of our drug to get any kind of response at all. And when we're not using our drug, we're walking around with a balance tilted to the side of pain, which means that other more modest rewards are no longer enjoyable. And when we're not using, we're experiencing the universal symptoms of withdrawal from any addictive substance, which are anxiety, irritability, insomnia, dysphoria, and intrusive thoughts of wanting to use our drug. And that's really the addicted brain. Now, if we abstain for long enough from our drug of choice for those neuroadaptation gremlins to hop off, which is another way of saying for our own bodies to start to make dopamine again back to baseline levels, then eventually we will restore a level balance or homeostasis, and we will get out of that craving, irritability, anxiety, and be able to enjoy more modest rewards. But honestly, it can take a long time, because once those gremlins kind of camp out on the pain side, they're not, it takes a while to get your tents down and clean up the fire pit and load up the car, right? It can take, really weeks to months in order for people to fully restore homeostasis. In my clinical experience, and this is supported by some evidence, it takes a minimum of 4 weeks to restore baseline homeostasis and get out of that state of constant, psychological distress and craving. And for people with severe addictions, the improvements continue to occur over many months. Often it can take a year or two for full homeostasis to be restored.
Definitely. And when you talk about any kind of a drug, that could be anything, right? Whether it's any kind of a pill, any kind of a substance, or even a person, right? Drug is basically, when we are talking about drug, we are talking about the stimulus, that initial stimulus that you are getting the dopamine from. So, and just as Dr. Huberman talked about that, that particular drug could be a any kind of a relationship with a particular person. You might be seeing all the 9 red flags, but just because you had one green flag in that particular person, you got addicted to that person. So when we talk about the drug, we talk about the actual stimulus behind that dopamine hit that you have been getting out from, right? Am I correct?
Yeah, yes. So anything that releases dopamine in our brain's reward pathway has the potential to be addictive. The more dopamine it releases and the faster it releases that dopamine, in other words, the quicker and more it tilts that
Yeah,
balance to the side of pleasure, the more likely it is to be addictive. Now, you have to keep in mind drug of choice. So what tilts one person's balance may not tilt another person's balance. We're all wired just a little bit differently, which makes sense from a population evolutionary perspective. Like, you wouldn't want everybody chasing after, the
one goal.
same girl, right? You would want some people to be really interested in, finding a berry bush, and other people to be really, really interested in, I don't know, finding water or something. You wouldn't want everybody to be equally attracted to the same reward. So evolution Mother Nature has accommodated that by giving us like a slight variations there. But you're absolutely right. Anything that releases dopamine has the potential to be addictive. And there's no doubt that for some people, their drug of choice is relationships. My colleague Rob Malenka, in a study published just in the last couple of years, has shown that oxytocin, which is our love hormone, it's the one that's released with pair bonding, binds specifically to dopamine releasing neurons in the reward pathway part of the brain and causes those neurons to release dopamine and serotonin. So it's very clear now emerging in the science that connection releases dopamine. And I can tell you from my clinical experience, it's very clear that for some people, their drug of choice is love, other people, sex, which is all kind of in that same basic category. I will also add that, one of the book is called Dopamine Nation, and one of the main points of the book is that our primitive evolutionary wiring, which was so healthy and adaptive for a world of scarcity and ever-present danger, is really not adaptive for the modern ecosystem, where we're
Yeah.
essentially surrounded by these highly potent, virtually infinite, and when I say virtually, I mean that literally on the internet, they are infinite, TikTok, pornography, you never run out of it. Novel forms of drug, including, drugs that sort of simulate human connection. And so that makes us all more vulnerable to addiction, including, addiction to other people, because now we've got this super potent form of human connection that really requires very little work on our part. Remember, dopamine's also connected to movement, and movement's connected to effort, and effort is a form of work. And we don't even have to work very hard. So we're short circuiting,
Yeah.
so much of sort of how our brains really intended for us to be able to connect with other people. Again, and that all of that makes it much more addictive.
Definitely. And you talk about this brain chemistry of withdrawal, right? That's a push-pull mechanism, that
Yeah.
scale. So at the time, once we are having this kind of a dopamine hit, and once we start subsidizing below the baseline level, are we aware at that particular point of time that it's going below the baseline level? How does our body respond to it? Because a lot of time, just if I'm doing something, any kind of an activity, if I'm being exposed to any kind of a stimulus which is providing me that dopamine hit, I just want more out of it, right? I'm
Right.
not able to identify, like, okay, this is enough for me, this might be tipping the scale on the other side, I should stop right now. It could be anything. One more hour of learning, one more hour of reading, one more hour of training, basically, when we cater to my audience. So that, are we aware of that particular point of time that we are tipping the scale way too hard on how this pans out, basically?
Yeah. So thanks for asking that, because we're generally unaware of that. What the way that we experience that scale tipping to the side of pain is that ongoing desire for more.
Yeah.
Essentially, it is that pleasure pain balance tipping to the side of pain that drives the motivation to continue to try to obtain more of our drug, even when we're no longer enjoying it. But here's the good news. I do believe that we can become aware of the sensation once we realize what's happening in the brain, which is one of the main reasons I wanted to write Dopamine Nation, because with a kind of mindful self observation, it can come out of the unconscious recesses of our mind and come to the forefront. So, for example, just the other day, I was watching some YouTube videos and I found myself clicking on another and clicking on another and not even enjoying the activity, but
Yeah.
still wanting to find, not wanting to get off, wanting to find one more. And I then, was able to see, okay, I'm in a dopamine deficit state now, and my brain is driving me to continue to search for more potent forms of this drug in order to avoid the come down that I know I will feel as soon as I get off of YouTube. And so it doesn't necessarily make it easier to get off, because it's still really hard. But at least when we know what's happening, it can help, because it puts a little bit of a pause, and we're able to go, okay, I'm locked here. I'm locked in. I'm not a bad person. I'm not a lazy person. Um, but my brain isn't really set up for this kind of infinite, highly potent reward. And so I'm trapped. So I need to make myself get off of YouTube. And I need to know that probably for about a half an hour afterwards, I'm going to be really grumpy and unhappy. But if I can just wait it out and let those gremlins hop off, I can get back to that place where, I'm more, let's say, balanced. And then I can say to myself, you know what, tomorrow I'm not going to go onto the computer once, not one time, because I want to give my reward pathway a break, right? I want to
Yeah,
give my pleasure pain balance a rest, because it turns out that it's a lot of work for my brain to continually try to restore homeostasis. And that's exhausting. And that then adds to my stress. And then my stress makes me want to go on YouTube again, right? So it's this crazy vicious cycle. But if I can take time away, and I've done this so many times, and it's always worth it, then after some time has passed, I just start to feel so much better, and I'm not in that place of craving, which is why, as um, one of the main recommendations in the book is to do a dopamine fast, where for a period of time, no shorter than a day, but preferably longer, um, we give our reward pathway just a break. It's sort of like a period of fasting, so it doesn't have to work so hard, and we can restore baseline dopamine levels and feel better.
definitely. Very, very well summarized and very well said. And there is this a really high correlation in all the things that you just mentioned, that we live in the society which has molded us in a feed forward approach, right? We always have to keep on striving for more and more, more and more, and we somehow have lost the balance, or you can say the actual balance of just being standing still for a point of time and keep on thinking, okay, how far I have come, what needs to be done over the next course of time. And because we have been so much intertwined about just we have to do more and more, we cannot afford to stand still. That's how we never give our brain some kind of a breathing room to actually restore the balance. That highly correlates with that. And on that similar note that you just also mentioned, that when it comes to restoring the balance, in your dopamine nation book, you have mentioned a complete fasting, right? But on the other hand, when we see the other methods of some kind of a treating something, we always tend towards the approach of either ramping up or ramping down instead
Mm.
of a complete sudden abstinence of any kind of a stimulus or intervention, I should say. So, what made you choose that sudden abstinence of fasting instead of ramping up or ramping down method?
What I have found clinically is that it's really much harder to go from using a lot of a drug, and remember, I'm using that term drug very broadly.
Yep.
That includes behaviors as well. It's really hard to go from using a lot to using in moderation. It's easier to go from using a lot to using none at all, and then after homeostasis has been restored or level balance has been restored, and we're able to see more clearly, and we're able to enjoy other things, then to carefully try to reintroduce our drug back into our lives and see if we can maintain moderation based on strict self-binding around when we'll use, how much we'll use, why we'll use. Um, I have had only a very small number of patients over the years who could actually slowly taper down. Most patients can't do it.
Yeah.
And I think for most of us, it's hard, it's much harder. But instead to just say, okay, for the next 30 days, I'm not going to use it at all. And then I'm going to try going back to it is easier, believe it or not, than to try to just go to moderation.
Ramping down.
It just doesn't work. I also want to add that for some patients, asking them to just stop it is not a good idea, either because they just can't do it and they have to go into rehab or something like that, or because they might go into some kind of life-threatening withdrawal. So there are some
Yeah.
people who become so physically dependent on certain drugs like alcohol or benzos or opioids that if they were to just stop cold turkey, they could actually be at serious medical risk. So those people I also wouldn't ask. But for most people, who come into my practice who are struggling with some kind of compulsive overconsumption, the vast majority can go cold turkey, assuming they're willing to try it without any serious adverse medical consequences.
That explains the rationale behind it. And one more thing, I just on that similar note, I want to ask: all we all are we all vulnerable to the fundamental problem of addiction? And also, are there any kind of sexual differences? When I say sexual differences, basically, I'm trying to find out any kind of a specific addiction which are catered towards male versus females. Have you come across any kind of evidence, or whether it's anecdotal evidence or you can say actual scientific evidence? Are there any kind of a gender related addiction which are catered to one specific gender? Any kind of example that you want to give about?
Sure. So first of all, in terms of vulnerability, we are not all equally vulnerable to the problem of addiction, but we are all getting more vulnerable to the problem of
Yeah,
addiction because of the modern world. About 10 to 15% of Americans will develop some kind of severe addiction in their lifetime. And many of those people have significant risk factors. And risk factors include having a biological parent or grandparent with addiction. So there is a genetic or inborn component. Another risk factor is having a co-occurring mental illness, although that can often be tricky because the substance itself can cause psychiatric symptoms, not necessarily the other way around, so it can be hard to tease apart. Um, Having had experienced serious trauma, psychological, sexual, physical trauma can contribute to the risk of addiction. Simple access is a risk for addiction. Living in a place where drugs are easily accessible, which is essentially living in the modern world. Um, so, um, but it is true that, people have variable risk to this problem. And some people, genetically, they have an inborn propensity for addiction, which makes it much, much harder for them. In terms of gender differences, that's a really interesting question because for most of the last, hundreds of years, men compared to women were much more likely to struggle with addiction, on the order of like 5 to 1. So really many, many more men with addiction than women. But in the last 30 years or so, rates of addiction among women has gone way, way up. So, for example, especially among millennials in the United States, now, a young woman is just about as likely to develop an alcohol addiction as a young man. So that's something that's really changed in the last couple of generations. The other thing is when we're looking at digital or media addictions, in my experience, and I haven't looked at any data on this, but in my experience, young men or men in general are much more likely to get addicted to pornography and video games, and women are more likely to get addicted to social media.
yeah.
But again, I haven't seen a lot of good data on that. That's really primarily my clinical experience.
Yeah, even though it's an anecdotal experience, but still an anecdotal evidence is still an evidence. It still amounts to a lot of things because case reports are definitely, even though they are at the lowest part of the hierarchy, but they are still the part of hierarchy when it comes to the scientific
Oh, I agree with you. And I actually think they're the sentinel events. They're the very first signals. So long
evidence.
before for example, the opioid epidemic, long before there was any awareness of there being an opioid epidemic here in the United States, individual doctors were saying, "Hey, I'm
Yeah,
seeing this. I'm seeing this in my patients. My patients are, addicted to OxyContin. My patients are addicted to Vicodin." That was decades before, there really started to be any numbers, any data.
yeah, exactly.
So I think those anecdotal sentinel events are really, really important.
Yeah, because it takes a lot of time for that data to get accumulated and become statistically and practically significant.
That's
But
right.
before that, yeah, before that, we can directly have hop on to that anecdotal evidence or even case reports and see what is going on here. And we should cater our services to positiveness of that particular evidence or cater towards the negativeness of that particular evidence.
Yeah.
So with that in mind, Dr. Lemke, you have mentioned, I've heard a lot of podcasts, I have gone through a lot of podcasts where you have been featured, and you have such a really great and nuanced approach in finding the passion. Because just as you mentioned that you found the passion in being connected with the people, that's how you became a great psychiatrist in the first place. How do you go about and kind of a recommendation about when it comes to people who always say that just because if I'm only am able to find my passion, I will be able to escape from the reality I'm currently living in, and it suddenly change my life. So how does particular approach worked out, and that's in your particular experience in finding the passion? Because every time we see we have this kind of feed forward approach, right? I have to find something, I have to find something, instead of just pushing the baby into the bath water and let her or him swim and
Hmm.
acquire the skill in this world, and then that's how they should be finding their passion in the first place. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, this is one of my big messages because I see so many young people who come in anxious and depressed and feel like if they could only find their life purpose and life passion, then all would be well. And what I say to people gently is, if you're looking for that one thing that's gonna, be your passion, you're probably gonna spend the rest of your life looking and never
Yeah,
find it. Instead, what you really need to do is dial open to the real world around you, to the, to the life that God gave you or Mother Nature gave you, and just see what you're called to do, what needs to be done. And it might even be something as simple as like clean your room. Like today, the universe is calling you to clean your room. And the accumulation of very small steps where we're just open to what we can do now to make the world a little bit better does really lead to very good places. You have to be patient, and it's not necessarily going to be like fame and riches and all of that, but it is going to be a sense of meaning, purpose, and connectedness to the life that you've been given. And I think that's really what we all want. It's not so much that we want fame and riches. Sometimes we think that'll make us happy. I think it's clear that that doesn't work. People who are rich and famous are some of the most unhappy people I've met. But what we want is a sense of being tethered to the world, connected in our bodies, in our lives, authentically experiencing, ourselves in the world. And how to do that is the question. And, what I recommend is, again, that instead of running away from our anxiety, our depression, our fears, instead of constantly distracting ourselves with things on the internet, drugs, alcohol, that we essentially push away those intoxicants and instead turn and face the things that we're afraid of and just let ourselves tolerate them and even dive into them. So a kind of paradoxical um, turning, into our lives. Um, because really, the truth is, if we focus for long enough on just about anything, it will become interesting. It really
yeah,
will. It's just a matter of investing ourselves. So, I mean, the first thing obviously is to not distract ourselves and not use drugs and alcohol and other addictive behaviors, to put those away, to let ourselves tolerate withdrawal, to let ourselves tolerate boredom, to let ourselves tolerate anxiety. And then slowly with time, if there's something in our lives that annoys us or that we wish weren't in our lives or that we find burdensome, instead to really flip it and say, you know what, I'm going to look right at that thing. I'm going to dive into that thing and I want to explore it. And it's just really fascinating when we do that, how it changes shape. It becomes interesting. We can solve problems. It becomes purposeful. So I really actually in my mind, I really visualize it as like a pivot, that instead of running away, I literally envision I stop running, I pivot, I face that thing, I walk toward it. And I'm surprised, almost always surprised, at that thing that I sort of saw as monstrous. It changes shape.
yeah. Exactly. So instead of a feed forward approach, we should be taking care of a feedback approach. Sometimes we have to just grasp in the moment and see what needs to be done. And a lot of time finding the passion basically starts with just boredom and monotony. It's
That's right.
the beauty of monotony, because monotony will help you determine what is the actual signal and what is the actual noises. Otherwise,
Mm,
if you have constantly been changing a lot of variables, whether it's in terms of finding your work, what you want to do, in terms of finding the actual thing, or in terms of finding any kind of a particular relationship. If you have always been in this kind of a dilemma that you have to constantly moving, at some point of time, you have to stand still, think about it, see the action steps, do those action steps for a brief amount of time, embrace that monotony, and that might be the route to success that you have been neglecting all this time. So will that correlate with that monotony and
yeah,
boredom?
no, that's really, yeah, I mean, I think the way you're describing it is, I would agree, it's a kind of a slowing down.
Yeah,
And that's a big thing. First of all, rushing causes a lot of adrenaline to be released, which adds to our stress. Even outside of conscious awareness, you can actually get addicted to adrenaline, right? You can get
yeah,
addicted to rushing around. That can release dopamine, because even adversive stimuli can release dopamine, because dopamine is a way to signal we need to pay attention to danger in the environment. Um, so you're absolutely right to slow down, to de-adrenalize experiences, to embrace the sameness, to embrace boredom. So much of our lives online is all about reacting to stimuli. But if we're
yeah,
in this constant mode of reacting, then we're not in a mode of creating. And in order to really create, we have to have at least some period of time where we're not reacting, where we're still, where we're quiescent, where we're waiting, really waiting for what will unfold. And in fact, if you are not in a regular practice of doing that, it is terrifying. I mean,
yeah,
it's really scary. It's like, oh my God, what's going to happen next? But that is really important, I think, to having this experience of authentic unfolding, the sense of being real in the world, real in your body, and having, an experience that feels like it's really tied to your life. In my younger days, I used to have quite a few episodes of what's called derealization or depersonalization. And this was way before the internet. I would have these kind of acute peak anxiety episodes, especially if I was far from home and I was staying in like a hotel. And to me, hotels are really alienating environments. I was not with my family or friends. I was in a new place. And I would have these intense feelings that I'm not real or the world is not real. Very, very scary stuff. But now I have that very seldom. I don't have that very often anymore. Still, occasionally I'll get some echoes of it. Um, but I think that's because I've learned better how to be still in the moment and kind of connect with my own authentic sort of unfolding in the moment. And I have a lot of patients who struggle with derealization and depersonalization. I think the internet has made that even worse,
yeah,
because it has created literally like kind of this matrix and this alternative reality where we're not really connecting with ourselves and our real life lives. And so now when we're in our real life lives, it can feel like, it's a come down essentially.
yeah,
And then we're disoriented. And so again, I think unplugging and just slowing it down, as you say, tolerating boredom, tolerating being in a non-reactive space, and just letting those feelings bubble up and then pass again, because they always do. I mean,
yeah,
when as they're peaking, we feel like, help, get me out of here. But they will. It can't go up without coming down. That's good for the bad and the good. I mean,
yep,
that's, when you think about why would Mother Nature make this balance and torture us with the come down? The reason is because it works on the pain side too. If we get a painful stimulus, those gremlins hop on the pleasure side
pleasure.
and tilt it here, because then what happens is our bodies start to say, oh, we're in trouble. We better make some dopamine, some norepinephrine, some serotonin. We need to upregulate that stuff to combat this threat in the environment. So thank goodness, right? Because if it was pain and then it was just here, I'd be like, bummer. But if it's pain and then it's, endogenous opioids and cannabinoids, and we get some respite and then we're level again. So, and that's true for our emotions as well. They will peak and then they will ebb.
Yeah, definitely, because the bigger they are, the harder they fall as well.
Yeah.
So it goes for both the side, both for the pleasure side and both for the pain side. And Naval Ravikant has also mentioned a really great thing, that if you really want to find a passion about yourself, you have to generate that specific knowledge, that skill which is unique to you. So anyone can snatch that degree out of your basically hand, or they can revoke your degree. But if you have generated the skill, the which is really, really unique to you, that nobody can snatch it out of you, right? And no matter how many jobs government creates, if you have not catered or developed that skill, you will never be worthy about that kind of a job, and you will always complain that there is so much unemployment in this particular society, right? So we have to,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, I like that. And I think, what I would add to that, though, is that it doesn't have to be a unique skill. I think there's this
yeah,
idea that we have to be like the one and only, or
completely,
the first of, or the one off. It's like, no, I mean, you can develop a skill that many other people have. But when you authentically develop expertise
yep,
or knowledge in that area, it's yours, right?
it's
You
yours.
you you own it. It's a part of your DNA. And it's really valuable because it comes from you, but it doesn't have to be something that nobody
Completely
else
out of the
has.
blue, yeah.
Right.
Exactly. So, with that in mind, let's us steer towards the actual addiction part. So, we have talked about a lot about the basic technologies, and now we are in the middle of the segment. So, before we deep dive into the dark side of the addiction, people do not realize that they are addicted, but they are addicted to the good things. They are addicted to the things which are highly rewarded as per the standards set by the society. Let's suppose that we are addicted to the work. And if I talk about myself, I'm addicted to the sports science, I'm addicted to
Mm.
the training, the nutrition aspect of it. And this kind of self realization happened when the pandemic hit, the COVID hit, and all the
Right.
gym centers got closed and everything got closed. And it happened with everyone who were so much addicted in the good side. Their work had stopped, my training
Right.
stopped, and I was at my peak. It's a sudden realization that someone snatched the identity out of me, and I was not
Yeah.
able to cope up with that, right? So that was the addiction that each and every individual who is at their peak of their career, they are somehow addicted. So would you like to
Yeah.
throw some light on that particular thing?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the addiction to work, addiction to exercise. I mean, we generally think of work and exercise as kind
Good
of good
things. Yeah,
addictions, right?
yeah,
Why? Because they require effortful engagement over a long period of time. The rewards are delayed. It's not like taking a drug or looking at pornography where you get this sudden, hit of
yeah,
dopamine followed by a sudden deficit. It's a more gradual and then sustained improvement. So in general, that kind of effortful engagement over long periods of time, I consider to be a healthy and adaptive source of dopamine. But even so, if it's taken away from us, we will go into withdrawal.
yeah,
Plus, as you say, what we do becomes who we are. And so, it is embedded. What we do is becomes core to our identity, especially if we haven't acquainted ourselves with ourselves, and we've really relied on these external characteristics to sort of define who we are. So yeah, COVID was stressful in that way because it just shifted up most people's routines, right? The things that they did, and then all of a sudden, kind of an existential crisis where like, who am I if I'm not doing these things?
yeah,
Plus,
exactly.
plus withdrawal, right? Literal withdrawal from, that dopamine that you were getting from working out or whatever your training is. So yeah, that's really challenging, but I think it can be also a good exercise, again, trying to look at it as an opportunity to learn
Yep.
something about ourselves, even if it's painful.
Yeah, much. It's more like a holistic approach about knowing what things are actually going about. So how I came about this kind of a realization is because I was having a really mindful talk with one of my significant other that she mentioned that she never gets addicted, and I was trying to explain that you are addicted,
Yeah,
but you are addicted to the things which are highly rewarded in the society as per the
that's right.
society standards. You are addicted to the work, you are addicted to eating good, you are addicted to the
Right.
exercising. But the reality hit to me is because when we are going on a date, and I was going through this menu at this hotel, and I was thinking, how much calories there is it? How does this food is applicable to my training plan, or does
Mm,
it fit into my nutrition plan? And at that particular point of time, I made this decision, right? This is not it should be. This is not how it should
mhm.
be, right? Because fitness, my career, my sports science career, my training and nutrition should potentiate my other aspects of the life. They should not
Yeah.
dictate my other aspects of the life, right?
Mhm.
Because at this point of the time, my priority is to spend some quality time with my significant other. And if I in my entire mind is focused on this thing, that whether this food is good and bad, how much calories there is, whether it will fit in my nutrition and training program, I'm just not living in that moment, which is precious to me. So I was like, I am addicted. This needs to be stopped. I have to
Mm.
be a bit mindful about where
Mhm.
my things are being potentiating me in the right direction, or are they actually taking me away from that kind of direction. So that kind of a self-realization is highly, highly important, and you will realize these kind of things once you stand still at certain point of time. When you have traveled a journey, at some point of time you have to stand still. You have to see how much you have wisdom that you have gathered over the period of time, and then learn from it and move from it. So with that in mind, since we have a really great segue about addicted to the right things, now let's dive into the addicted to the wrong things and the things that you have mentioned in the book. So when I read your book, the first case study which you have mentioned is of being a sex addict. It's almost like throwing the crackers on someone's face just the moment they started reading that book. So, what made you choose that kind of a hard hitter first story, case story, to get that initial buy-in about this particular dopamine nation, or any when you were going through the initial writing phase, and how you came about in deciding what should
Yeah.
be shared first?
hmm
Yep.
So for me, Jacob's story was sort of the story,
Yep.
because he's a wonderful, kind man. He's a brilliant scientist. He's got top education. He's got a wonderful family, and yet he became severely addicted to pornography, compulsive masturbation, and then ultimately made a machine to masturbate himself.
Yeah.
And to me, that was just this amazing crystallization of this crazy world that we live in, that we live in a time and a place when you can have all of the good things in your life, right? Great education, great job, great family, and still get addicted. And that the technology itself really is the vehicle by which something that is, should be healthy and adaptive and a source of joy, then becomes this terrible source of suffering. So to me, that was really, really the story. And I thought his masturbation machine was also a really apt metaphor for all of our digital devices, the ways
Yep.
in which we're using our phones and our laptops to meet so many of our needs without turning to the people in our lives, right? We can get our emotional needs met. We can get our sexual needs met. We can entertain ourselves. We almost don't need other people, right? Because we've got
Yep.
the internet sort of doing it all for us. And that's scary, because one of the things that happens as we get addicted is we isolate. We get more and more isolated from the people around us. And that's just not healthy. Like, we're social creatures. We
Yep.
need to stay connected to real people in real life. Not to say that we can't have real connections online, because we can, but we can't let it be the place that we constantly retreat to, running away from, our real life experiences. And then finally, the reason that I open with that is because, as you know, I describe in there my own kind of compulsive overconsumption of romance novels, something that was exacerbated by my e-reader, my Kindle, to the point where I was really not enjoying many things that I used to enjoy. I was obsessed, with reading in every free moment that I could, and not like reading good stuff. I mean, this was trash, trashy erotica. I'm really looking for like that transportive experience that would just get me out of myself and get me out of my life. I just was looking for something to escape into. And by the way, I have a really good life, right? I don't really have a good reason even to want to escape my life. It would make more sense if my life, had a lot of bad things in it, which a lot of people's lives do, and I feel for them. But I've got nothing to run away from, and yet there I was, kind of chasing fantasy. And I think a lot of it has to do with the ways in which even activities like reading have become drugified. They've been made
Yeah,
more accessible, more potent, more novel, more abundant. Which means that we'll all eventually find our drug of choice. If we haven't found it yet, we'll find it soon. And we're all struggling, I think, with various forms of this kind of compulsive overconsumption.
yeah, exactly. And just as you mentioned that you got addicted to this fantasy novel, how that perspective changed your thinking capability when your fantasy, or you can say that escape from reality, is no longer matching with your current reality? Because if you read a lot of romantic fantasy novels, your bar has been set so much high, especially for young teenage girls, right? That
Yeah.
your ideal guy has to be this, the type and the level of love you should be experiencing should match the fantasy novel writing. But once you are unable to match that particular fantasy novel writing experience in your real life, because of course it's a fantasy,
Mm.
it can never be your real life, right? How you cope up with that kind of a gap between your fantasy versus the reality, and what changes
Yeah.
that you have faced
Yeah. So,
about?
so that's an interesting question. I don't think it worked quite like that, at least not in my experience. I do not think that somehow I thought that the reality should live up to the fantasy.
Fantasy.
It was more that because I was bombarding my reward pathway with this rewarding experience, which could have been anything. It could have been alcohol, it could have been cannabis, it could have been, shopping, um, any number of things. It could have been watching YouTube videos. For me, it happened to be romance novels. But the point really is that because I was constantly able actually to achieve that euphoria that
Yeah.
came with escaping, that my brain was just working so hard to compensate, and so was down regulating, dopamine and other feel good neurotransmitters, so that when I wasn't reading, nothing else was enjoyable. It wasn't so much like I was like, oh, why isn't my husband more like Edward in Twilight? It
Yeah.
wasn't like that. It was just sort of like, oh God, when am I going to be able to get back to reading? When is this going to be over? When is this
Okay.
family dinner going to be over so that I can go and read my book? And I think that's the trap, right? It's that reality gets increasingly unrewarding
Yep.
because this other thing is so rewarding. And I just want to be in that headspace. I don't want to deal with this. And we think what can happen is we think it's like, oh, I don't like my family, or I don't like my husband, or I don't like my job. Not because we expect them to be like the romance novel, but just because we don't enjoy the time with them. What we don't realize is that we're not enjoying that time because our brain is recalibrated to the incredible amount of dopamine we got when we were doing our drug. And now it's just basically like reeling from that. It's the after effect. That's what we don't see. It's hard to see that connection. It's just like, I'm unhappy now. I'm happy when I'm reading. I want to go
Yeah,
back to reading.
exactly. And in that, in your case, that you had this kind of a wisdom that you can figure it out what escape is from reality and what is reality is. I have seen a lot of people that they think that the kind of fantasy novels, even any kind of a movie that they watch, any kind of a romantic movie, they start expecting that they might be able to find that similar kind of a mate, soulmate in
Mm.
their real life. And once maybe they will find it, more power to them if they do find it. But chances are they might also not find it, especially in that close proximity of that particular exposure to that stimulus, right? So once they are not unable or they are unable to find that kind of a reality check, they get somewhat down regulated. Our you can say side of the scale gets really bombarded with this kind of ghrelins, right? So that's how what they change their reality. So have you seen any kind of this kind of behavior in your clients on where they're kind of
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, when we're sort of trying to maintain that feeling that we get from our drug, inevitably our real lives will seem less enjoyable.
yep,
And again, that's just, and however we conceptualize that, maybe we tell ourselves that that person isn't, the person for me, when in fact it's not that person. It's that our reward pathway has been hijacked by this other stimulus. So yeah, I mean, I see that a lot, whether it's about another person or about their job or about where they live, people wanting to change something, thinking that that will make a difference. But what will really make a difference is if they eliminate those highly rewarding drugs and behaviors and let their own reward pathway recalibrate.
exactly. And one more thing that you also mentioned, that at this point of time, since everything is available at the tip of our fingertip, right? The moment we need any kind of food, we can just order it through any kind of app, or we need any kind of a reward. As long as you have certain amount of money, you can get everything you want, just tap of a single button. So
Yeah.
which makes us less prone to move, because dopamine is also associated with the movement. So now, since yeah, we are more bored, we have more access towards more highly palatable things. That's how we are also becoming addicted. Is this correlation right, or you want to further throw some light on this particular thing?
Yeah, I mean, just the hyper convenient world that we live in, we don't have to wait for anything. And time is really an important part of making sure that we don't accumulate gremlins. So I'm not saying to people you should never indulge,
Hmm.
or I'm not saying you shouldn't like look for pleasure in your life. That's not it. But you want to make sure that when you tilt your balance to the side of pleasure, know that there's going to be a cost, but if you leave enough time between pleasure, then there'll be enough time for those gremlins to hop off and for homeostasis to be restored. But what we have now with our devices and the supply chain and just the incredible access, we don't have to wait, right? As
Yeah.
soon as, we've consumed that, we can go right on to the next one. And that's really dangerous because that's what it causes, this accumulation of gremlins on the pain side, and puts us into this dopamine deficit state. It makes it harder and harder to break away from that state of being and kind of come down, because we're trying to delay the come down, avoid the come down. And we can do that. We can actually do that now because there are so many drugs and they're so accessible and they're so potent. I mean, eventually we'll run out. I mean,
Yep.
eventually the drugs won't run out, but they'll stop working. It may take a month, a year, 10 years, but trust me, eventually that drug turns on us. And then not only is it not working, but it actually becomes a source of excruciating pain, which is really fascinating and paradoxical, and has to do with this balance where you get to a point where you do your drug, you don't get any pleasure at all, but you get boom, you get pain right from it. And my patients will tell me, patients who have used cannabis for years to help them sleep or manage anxiety will get anxious, paranoid, and wide awake when they smoke cannabis now. Patients who have been taking opioids for pain and will get pain, physical pain from opioids. And other, I've seen people with compulsive masturbation actually get pain with orgasm,
Yeah.
because they've done it so many times. So it's our brains really were not adapted for this constant, close proximity, reinforcing drugs and behaviors.
definitely. And when it comes to the accessibility, it goes both the ways for the richest of the richest and the poorest of the poor. Everything is becoming accessible. The gap has never been this small when it comes to the entire history of the humankind, right? So even the poorest of the poor have the access for each and everything, and they are spending a lot of time and money when it comes to the leisure goods, right? So
Yeah, this is a huge problem because, you know, it, if you are a poor person living, especially in a richer or developing emerging nation, you're probably the most vulnerable because not only do you
yeah,
not have access to things like fresh air and nature and enough time to exercise and time to spend with family because you're working some horrific job, but at the same time, you have disposable income and you can spend it on, Netflix and pornography and phones and stuff to smoke and stuff to drink, and that stuff at the same time has also become more available, cheaper. So it's a really tragic thing. There are more people struggling with obesity on the planet than
yeah.
there are people struggling with being hungry, for the first time in human history. 70% of global deaths are due to modifiable risk factors like smoking, physical inactivity, and poor diet. So we've really reached a tipping point in humanity, even in poor and emerging countries.
Exactly, 100%. So, you have mentioned that sex addiction and especially the pornography and social media addiction, how these things, because these are tightly correlated with the technology, and they are getting abused basically by the people who have created these kind of endeavors, right, for the general population consumption. So, how this social media connection, and Dr. Humerman also talked about that if you have been consuming any kind of a pornography for a long period of time and you have been getting that dopamine hit, regular intimacy will no longer feel appealing to you, right? And it's becoming so much harder for people, especially young age males and both females, that they have being diagnosed with erectile dysfunction. It's not because there is something wrong with there, it's just a signal which is emerging from their brain because their dopamine has been shut down to that particular level that they are not able to initiate that particular HPT access, and now these kind of repercussions that are going to they are facing. So, what are your thoughts on social media and pornography, and how these things pan out in a real world?
Yeah, I mean, so pornography is almost always coupled with masturbation.
Yeah.
Masturbation leads to orgasm, which leads to a flooding of feel-good neurotransmitters in our brains all at once. It's a very potent and very physical drug. With increasing use, people need more quantity-wise, but also more potency-wise, and they spend longer and longer doing it. Repeated masturbation, also more potent and more deviant forms of pornography. I have
Yes,
a lot
exactly.
of folks who come in and say, "Oh, I'm so embarrassed. I'm watching, this kind of pornography."
XYZ. Yeah.
Yeah, but usually it's a progression. They started out with sort of more conventional sort of scenes, and then they have to go to that in order to be able to, continue to
Keep
get to
getting
that,
that.
right, get to that level. And then, yeah, they develop real physical problems, inability to orgasm, like the whole refractory period, pain
Yeah.
with orgasm, various forms of erectile dysfunction. And then in their real life partner relationships, yeah, they're often, less able. Well, there's certainly what happens is it gets very difficult to have sex without at least fantasy, right? Because that becomes a learned circuit. The fantasy that associated with the pornography is very then tied to the orgasm. And so it becomes difficult then to be with the partner real in the moment and just feel what you're feeling,
Yep.
with your partner. So all that's very, very tricky. But I do always emphasize that, somebody can be addicted to pornography and still really love their partner. And so it's not necessarily about, not loving that person, or not even about not wanting to have sex with that person. The pornography and the masturbation really fulfills quite a different function that's separate from love. It's really a a self-soothing function, it's an escape function, a non-being. But it's very pernicious because it does mean then, we're less interested in sex with our partner because
Yeah.
we did it with ourselves, And of course, then that ability to micro control the orgasm also makes it appealing, which is not something that is as easy to do with a partner, where we kind of let go and let it unfold. And so all of these things make the attachment really complicated for people. It's hard to let go. It's oftentimes sex with a partner is really, really different than sex with
Yeah.
pornography. It's a different type of thing. I think, for sex with a partner to work, it has to be really sacred and very
Yeah.
intimate, and has to have kind of a sacred place. And it's a way to um, create and maintain intimacy, um, compassion, and all kinds of things. It's just a very different headspace than this kind of, erotic, pornographic thing. So it's important to talk through all that. With social media, again, what social media has done is basically drugified human connection with the bottomless bowls, with the likes, with these curated, beautiful images, with the sort of mass appeal of the way that we get this positive response from potentially millions of people all at once. That's incredibly potent. And then, a conversation with a friend is dull in comparison. Um, so again, it's all about the way that these super potent forms kind of hijack our brains, put us in a dopamine deficit state, and then make it harder for more modest rewards to be rewarding.
Definitely. Very, very well summarized. And I really love that particular entire segment. And with that in mind, Dr. Lemke, I think we have reached over the end of the segment. So first question which I want to ask, that how a particular layman person will be able to identify a potential addiction, whether they are actually getting addicted or they have already been addicted. What are the guidelines? What are the frameworks that uh, following those guidelines or following that blueprint, they are finally able to identify whether they are addicted to something or not?
Yeah, I mean, the things to look for are tolerance, needing more and more of a drug or more potent forms to get the same effect, which again, we talked about with pornography, could be things like more deviant forms of pornography. I think um, noticing that other things are no longer enjoyable, so that you're in that
Yeah.
dopamine deficit state where other more modest rewards, things that you used to enjoy, you don't enjoy anymore. You might wonder whether or not there's a drug or behavior that has essentially released so much dopamine that it's tipped you into a deficit state. Consequences from use, so finding that it's interfering with your other goals, your values, your relationships, your work. Those are hard to see because often people can't connect true cause and effect when they're
Yeah.
chasing dopamine, which is why I think one of the best ways to sort of figure out whether you're addicted is to do the dopamine fast. Eliminate that social media app or pornography or video games or cannabis or alcohol for an entire month. And it really does need to be a month because the first 2 days people feel worse before they feel better. They're in withdrawal. And it really takes going to the full 4 weeks before people can kind of come out of that place, look back, say, oh my goodness, that's surreal that I was doing that,
Yeah.
and really restore homeostasis and make, informed choices going forward about whether they want to reintegrate that substance or behavior back into their lives in a more modest way, which takes a lot of work, usually tracking and barriers, or whether they want to continue to abstain. So I think abstinence is a period of abstinence is actually a great way to figure out whether you're addicted.
Yeah, definitely. I think this entire answer of yours hit two bullets at the same time, because my next question was, first, if you have identified the potential addiction, how to break that addiction. And you just summarized that some kind of abstinence is definitely needed to actually figure it out whether you are addicted. And if you are addicted to some kind of a thing, then abstinence will give you the make you see the light at the end of the tunnel, that
That's
there's
right.
still a hope. And then you can steer your further drive away along the way. So with that in mind, my question was, since the book that you have published that came out, and all the case studies that you have mentioned in the book, any kind of any other further fascinating case study that you have came across which you might have included in the book if
Ah.
it had you had experienced that particular kind of case study before you published that book?
Well, yeah, I mean, there are lots of case studies wish that there had been room for in the book. I sort of had to choose examples. But I mean,
Yeah,
even since the book came out, I had the case of a young man who got terribly addicted to video games. And we did the 30-day abstinence trial from video games, and he got a lot better. And then he himself was motivated. He went back to using video games, but he put all kinds of, barriers in
yeah,
place so he wouldn't
various.
use them in the same way at the same time. And then I would just say lots of great emails from readers all over the world who have benefited and who have told me a little bit about, some of the things that they've been experiencing, as well as lots of readers who have readers of Dopamine Nation who have now tried a 30-day abstinence fast and found that they feel better and kind of recognize that. Some of the other last week I was talking to Stanford undergraduates in the Psychology 101 course, and I got some interesting questions. You actually asked some of them, but a young woman came up and said, "Can you get addicted to a person?" And I said, "Yeah, it releases dopamine. You can get addicted." I had somebody else say, "Can you get addicted to like negative obsessive thoughts?" And yeah, you really
Yeah,
can. You can kind of get addicted to your own anxiety and then kind of privilege that and constantly be like thinking, well, it's okay for me to worry about this all the time because I don't know, it's a bad thing in my life, so I should worry about it. But in fact, what you're doing is you're just like using up a lot of your energy and headspace worrying about something you can't change or solve. So you should really just let it go. But you're not, because in a way, your own anxiety is your comfortable place. That's sort of your happy place. So those sorts of ideas have been coming out more since the book was published. People wondering about just the wide variety of things that people can kind of get compulsive about.
definitely. Really love that piece. And my final last question is, of all the career years that you have been doing this, how much toll it has taken on your life or on your mind? Because being a psychiatrist, you have to be connected on the mental level with your particular patients or any kind of a person that you have been catering to. So how does that kind of thing? Because you always learn whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. If you are interacting with a person for a long period of time, you turn to latch out or receive some kind of a positive and negative energy from them, right? So how does this sequence panned out over the last almost like in your entire career? What kind of
Yeah.
tools that it has taken on you,
Oh my
basically?
gosh. Yeah, no, for me, it's a great privilege to be able to talk to patients. I feel that when they come to me and they open up about their struggles, I feel very honored that they trust me with that information. It's a real gift. I feel privileged to be able to witness their journey, and if I can help them in some small way, I feel that it gives a sense of meaning and purpose to my life. So I don't feel burdened by the interactions, not at all. In fact, sometimes, when I leave my office and go home, there's a little bit of withdrawal, right? Because I've been
Yeah,
immersed in their lives, and then I have to sort of go, okay, wait, no, now I'm going, now I got to go back home and I got to take care of my kids and all of that. So for me, it's not burdensome. I don't carry it in a burdensome type of way. But a lot of people ask me that. A lot of people think, oh, it must be so hard to be a psychiatrist. It might be hard for some people, but for me, it's not.
definitely. That highly correlates that it is your true calling because
Yeah,
if you are able to finally figure it out that if you are able to separate your professional life and your personal life in these integrate level, especially being a psychiatrist where you are so much emotionally and mentally invested in your patients, it shows that you are really, really able to turn on and turn off that switch that once you are done with that particular thing, you are just done. There
yeah,
is no carryover or you can say phase interference between these two realities of your professional and personal
yeah,
life.
yeah. I think that's right. And somehow that trying to again be present, just really be present in the moment for what is happening is something that I really it's almost like a moral thing for me. Like I feel very strongly that the relationship between people is the most important thing in life, and so I try to really honor that in what I do. I don't always get it right, but I try to.
Definitely. So with that segment, one last question I have. We just have 2 more minutes of your time. How did your editors reacted when they saw the initial paragraph paraphrasing of your entire book and you putting that masturbation machine sequence in the first place, right? Did you face any kind of a pushback, and how did it pan out?
Yeah, so early on, there was definitely pushback. They said, can't you start with a case of somebody who got addicted to video games or something other than,
Yeah,
this case? And I just sort of held my ground. I said, no, this is the case. This is the case that sort of distills so many important aspects of this modern day problem. And this case is the book. I can't move this
yeah,
somewhere else. And eventually, to give them credit, they kind of said, okay, I understand that. So by the time I got around to, naming that first chapter, Our Masturbation Machines, they were already like, they knew that it was a done deal.
because that's what that what make the real true identity of that particular book, right? Because that was the really good initial segue, and that's what the message that you want to portray about. And
Yeah.
if someone is telling you to change that entire message, you'll be like, this is not the part, this is not the thing that, which is why I started in the first place, right?
Yeah, that and also, I think that um, if you try to second guess what will sell, at least for me,
Yeah,
that doesn't first of all, it's really, really hard to do, and it's ultimately not that satisfying because if your book doesn't sell, you're bummed. And if it does, that's probably, I mean, you not,
yeah,
you went for it, but that's not, I think it has to come really from a deeper place of what do I feel has meaning and will really
yep,
help people. Because I really do feel, I mean, it's great that the book it's a New York Times bestseller. It's done so much, being translated into 25 languages, so much better. I mean, I thought maybe four people would read it. So, of course, it's great that, it's resonated. But on the other hand, if only four people had read it, I would still feel proud of that book
yep,
because that book came from a deep place where I was really honoring what I had learned. I was honoring my patients and their journeys. It was an effort to give back and help other people. And so I felt like satisfied that I put on paper what I wanted to say. And yes, it's been great that it's been helpful to people, but even if I hadn't gotten that kind of response, I would still feel good about the book. Do you know what I
yep,
mean?
100%. Yeah, because the initial agenda of any kind of thing which we do as a sports scientist or can come from medical doctor is to help the people.
Right,
Becoming a bestseller at the New York Times, what was the byproduct of it, right?
right.
Because our main intention was the right, and it turned out to be in a right manner as well.
Right.
So that was the really great message, I would
Yeah,
say.
yeah. That's really.
So with that in mind, Dr. Lemke, where can listeners find your work and how they can reach out to you if they want to? Because you are not on social media,
Yeah,
that
no,
I
I'm
can
not. That's
say.
right. I'm not on social media. Well, there is my publisher, they made a website at annalemke.com or dopaminenation.com, and that has just a bunch of information. The book was actually has a UK publisher now.
Okay.
So Hachette or Headline is now selling the book, and it's available, where most places where books are sold. It's available on Amazon, obviously. I don't know specifically, in each given country, sort of
Yeah, yeah.
where they can get it.
We have
But
Amazon here. Yeah, we have
yeah,
Amazon here,
right.
and your book is available over there. So
Okay, good.
on the digital and paperbacks. So
Great. Yeah, it's Audible too. Audible. A
yeah,
lot of people love listen to it rather
yeah,
than read
exactly,
it. Yeah.
100%. I do prefer listening much better
Yeah,
because when I'm commuting for a long distance, it's a
right.
really, really great way to utilize the time.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's great. That's super.
So I will also reference out all the links in the description. So that would be really great. So with that note, Dr. Lemke, I'm really, really grateful for sparing your valuable time from your schedule and accepting this invitation and sharing your thoughts on really, really nitty and gritty details about the science behind the addiction, basically. So thank you for your time, Dr.
You're
Lemke.
welcome. It's been a pleasure to talk to you. And thank you for getting up in the middle of the night.
Ah, that's don't have to mention that. That's just you being humble. But it was my pleasure. Basically, the pleasure is all mine in order to hosting you and getting to know a lot more in depth about this entire neuroscience and the neurochemistry of addiction. So that was such a great experience from my side, and I hope it was a fruitful session for you as
Yes,
well.
wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much.
Hello, listeners. I hope you would have liked this episode of the podcast series. And if you did, please feel free to share it with your friends, families, and your colleagues so that they can also get benefit from the science based discussion that we just had. With that in mind, this podcast, along with all the episodes, is now available on all the major platforms like Spotify, Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, along with the audio visual medium YouTube. So, with that in mind, let me bid adieu for this time, and I will see you in the next episode.